see. Sir George, what do you think of this? Do you think it will happen to the Philippines, this so-called Sri Lankan debt trap? And what is really behind this? Is it really true that there's such a thing? This had been driven by the so-called Chinese loans, or this is just another propaganda against China? Can you give us a little bit of a background, and what do you think if there's a possibility that indeed this will happen in the Philippines? But of course, the other speaker can also butt in the discussion, especially on this particular issue. Thank you.
I think it's probably a mix of everything, and to point out that it's due to the Chinese debt trap is a total lack of perspective. But when we talk about loans and projects over a period of time, it's always subject to the approval, and in the Philippines, subject to the approval of NEDA, Department of Finance, etc., which our country for the last several administrations, in fairness, whether opposition or what type of, we've had very good financial management by our people, and almost every term we get awarded the top central banker in the world or top monetary board officials. No, so in the course of this period, from having been a basket case in terms of finance, actually we have actually become one of the best managed finance countries in the world, such that our ratings in the Fitch agencies or other rating agencies have come to be possibly in the top 10. In fact, in 2019, the Philippines was in the top 10 in terms of debt to GDP ratio at only some 45%, against many of the major countries, including Japan, US, China, at 150 or over 200%. So even today, the deterioration due to the pandemic, it became 65%, is still quite healthy and possible for us to manage very well. So the projects is up to us. If they talk about the debt trap, they should also look at the projects that succeed. For some reason, some of these media, they point out to the projects, number one, they didn't fail in the manner that's described. For instance, the Sri Lankan situation, the Chinese loans are some 20% of the loans and 15% of the loans, whereas the Japanese and Western loans are over 85%. They also don't point out the successes like the Piraeus port, in which Greece was almost crushed by the financial restrictions of the EU, but the port that Italy had refused to take and was taken by Greece has become maybe the number 4 port in all of Europe. That's a Chinese investment and might become number 3 and possibly even higher than that in all of Europe. So there are also a lot of successes. And if we look at our Philippine situation, if we remember several things, number one, in the 80s, the Jobo bills, when we had a financial crisis, these were loans. We had the devaluation. Our interest rates went up to 45% from the central bank itself. That's under Jobo Fernandez. And this was imposed by the World Bank and the IMF, in which all their major projects failed in the Philippines. And then later it happened again during the Asian financial crisis, which is very much similar to now. There was a lot of flow of finance, easy money from the West, and then they suddenly drew it and caused the Asian financial crisis. And then again in 2008, when the same thing happened, the US released so much currency into the system, so much dollars into the system, and suddenly withdrew it. It caused a worldwide collapse. And these are all US-led. And why are they talking about a Chinese debt trap? And they're not talking about these things, that the US caused a worldwide financial crisis and actually bankrupted several countries. In fact, the current situation is several countries are on the verge of bankruptcy. And that's because the US, as pointed out by one of our speakers earlier, Mr. Powell, everybody knows he's personally competent, but maybe he couldn't stand the pressures from the administration. He allowed Trump to push him into continuing to release money when everybody was already saying it was already sufficient, it was not needed. But what happened is, not only did he keep releasing money, when Biden came in, he continued to release money, such that the original intent of releasing some $1.5 trillion ended up being releasing some between $4 and $5 trillion. You have to remember that China, over a period of some 40 years, with over 1 billion people working very hard, was able to accumulate maybe $2-3 trillion of reserves, of which 1.2 trillion they put in the US. And the US, in one flick of the switch, created $5 trillion released to the whole world. And now it's creating inflation because they released that money without increasing production. The production is coming from the rest of the world, so the goods become more and more expensive, not to mention the sanctions that the US is forcing the world to undertake. And so now they feel that this inflation might become a crisis in the US, and they're sucking out the money, causing devaluation in countries like the Philippines. We now have more than 10% devaluation. The European Union has 12% devaluation, not to mention inflation of goods. So these are caused by the US. So that means 10% of all our assets can be purchased at less than 10% the value it originally had by towards the end of last year. And this is US imposing their currency manipulations on the rest of the world. When they're talking about Chinese currency manipulations, these last manipulation are the biggest ever in the history of the world, and it's not being pointed out. So, but we cannot complain because we're all dependent on this financial system. We just have to manage it. What we can say is we have very competent officials, and even this current administration, even the international bankers have indicated they're very satisfied with the election of the officials. Now we have to see how they actually act. It looks like that we will be able to weather this.
So can I add something, Anna?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, Sir George.
The question was on Sri Lanka.
Yes.
And where an economic collapse led to a political collapse, economic crisis to political crisis. It's about time that this issue about the debt trap should be set aside. Always blaming China, when in fact the debt trap of Sri Lanka was already indebted years and decades before China came in. The debt to China is only about 10 to 13%. And the rest of it, up to 70%, is to the IMF, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. These two global institutions are always the culprit behind the economic crisis in the developing world. So that's to correct this misinformation and to put into record that no country should be blamed on the economic collapse of course, Sri Lanka itself has its own internal implosion, internal reasons for, economic mismanagement, corruption, and so on and so forth. Good that the political crisis is giving way to a new set of officials. So let's see how they will be able to manage the whole situation.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Bobby, for that additional information and also clarification on this issue, because it's really been in many international media, and it's always about China debt trap, So it's good to have such kind of clarification. Dr. Dan, do you have anything to say before I ask Paul if he has a question?
Oh, I would have a lot to say, but I will try to keep it to the minimum. It's a very important subject matter, and I couldn't have agreed more with the previous speakers. And while I say something, I wonder if Austin could take a slide that has to do with the cost of the overstretch that I would like to use. But prior to going to this, I just would like to remind us all that in the early period of the Duterte administration, there was this famous piece that came out in Forbes of all sources, of all media, how the new Philippine debt of $167 billion could balloon to $452 billion, and China would benefit from this. This was an extraordinary statement, so I took a closer look at that, and it would have basically meant that within 5 years, the level of debt that was about 40% of the GDP at the time, I think, would have gone to the Japanese level or beyond. That's almost impossible. Now, substantially, it was a hoax. But here in the Philippines, it was portrayed in some media as something to be seriously taken. And for the best of me, it was very hard to understand why. So out of intrigue and out of, I think, petty sense of revenge, I wrote 2 or 3 columns of that debt and what had happened to it first 2017, then 2019, and now. And of course, the situation is what we know. If there is an increase of the debt, that has a hell of a lot to do with the pandemic effect. Now, regarding the Sri Lanka situation, let's be real about this. They had an independence war, civil war that took decades, destroyed the country, devastated the infrastructure, created much resentment, caused so many losses in terms of economics, human lives. What we see now is the aftermath. And in that aftermath, naturally, those who want to destabilize further to get the leadership that they want like to portray the problems as a consequence of one actor rather than the other, in this particular case of China. This is disheartening for another reason. I said earlier that I think nowadays you really have to choose geopolitics or economic development. You can't have both. When Xi Jinping around 2013 came up with this idea of having new type of great power relations, many of my friends on the Chinese side were actually very excited. There was a certain sense of idealism. Perhaps for once in history, we could have a situation where we could work together, where we could cooperate. Now I'm afraid that the worst has happened. And I'm not talking about the amount of guns, weapons, or arms, or money, or funds. I'm talking about the loss of strategic trust. The strategic trust that used to exist bilaterally between the United States and China. When you lose it, it is terribly, terribly hard to restore it. And my last point on this matter is, if you look at the slide that Austin found, I would like to make note of the fact that this will hurt. This kind of situation where the geopolitics comes first prior to the economic development has hurt and will hurt most of the US economy. And by default, because of the great role of the US economy still in the world economy, many other countries will pay the bill, particularly those that are most vulnerable. But I don't think people understand how serious the situation is and how far it is. Just one example, the slide that you see, the level of debt in the US after the pandemic is at the level where it was after the war effort in World War II. And it is not stopping, it's not going down, it is soaring up. And that means that these deficits are projected to drive federal debt held by the public to unprecedented levels. We don't know what it means, to be honest, when they go so high.